So I'm here actually just to tell you a story. It's a story that we did a technical study to look at the historical impacts of groundwater use in the Central Valley to try to understand what happens to groundwater levels and what the impacts to stream flows look like. So like with all good stories, let me start first with our mission. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. We work all around the globe to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. Clearly, water is not only on the surface, but below the ground. And so I'm here, I think Dr. Kaparsky promised some groundwater-dependent ecosystems, and here they are. So in California, we have these amazing things called groundwater-dependent ecosystems. For those of you not familiar with that term, that includes plants, animals, and natural communities that rely on groundwater to meet all or a portion of their water needs. That includes places, amazing places like the Amargosa River that is highly dependent on groundwater and springs. It's places like the Shasta Valley up in the northern part of the state where these amazing salmon runs depend on cold water springs. It's places like these desert palm oases, literal oases in the middle of the desert. Sand dunes all the way around until you turn around one sand dune and wow, there's just amazing, you hear the birds, you see water, you see these amazing palms. It's just a literal oasis. And for those of you who are not compelled by landscapes, we have cute critters as well. So in the state of California, we have things like the pupfish, we have red-legged frog, the California newt, and our coho. So why are we interested in groundwater at the Nature Conservancy? For those of you who know us, we own tons of land across the state of California. We've created places like the Cosumnes River Preserve here, which is just south of Sacramento. This is a place where we've invested decades of investment of public funding with many partners to create a 55,000 acre nature preserve. This preserve has this amazing, some of the last, biggest, and best remnants of riparian habitat, so the habitat that's seen along river systems. It's the only undammed river flowing west off the Sierra. There's all these amazing things about this river system. And like all good river systems, you would see water coming out of it. Over the years, we started to notice that unfortunately, the dry portion of the river was getting longer, and it was staying dry for longer periods of time. This is causing a problem. So not only is it not as pretty to look at, but it also sustains a really important salmon run. And when the water isn't available for the salmon to run upriver in the fall, you have a problem. So this huge investment that we had made at places like the Cosumnes, this is not the only place where this story is happening. That led us to start really looking at groundwater in a serious way. So about 10 years ago, TNC started trying to understand the interaction between groundwater and the places where we were working. And that was kind of a localized effort, just kind of looking at the preserves and the places where we worked. But we came to realize that this is a much bigger story. It's not just the places what we've invested in, it's about the natural resources of the state of California. So several years back, we undertook this study. This is a recently released report that was completed in 2014, but just released earlier this year, that basically uses Department of Water Resources, groundwater surface water model called the California Central Valley Groundwater Surface Water Simulation Model, affectionately known as C2VSIM, to look at the impacts of what happens to groundwater levels and groundwater surface water interactions as you pump water over time. So this study basically looked at Central Valley historically to simulate what happened for the period 1922 to 2009. And it tells us a story that I think has a lot of implications and lessons that we should apply as we go to implement SGMA. So for those of you who don't know, we're talking about the Central Valley. It's the big flat bit in the middle of the state responsible for a huge amount of agriculture. I am a Central Valley native, so it's near and dear to my heart. But it's this big, huge area. And there are three main basins in this area. And those three main basins really tell us kind of three phases of a story. And that's what I wanted to share with you now. So the backdrop of this story is kind of depressing. Since settlement, we here in the state of California have managed to destroy over 90% of our wetlands and river habitat. So when we talk about remaining groundwater-dependent ecosystems in the state of California, this is the last 10%. Okay, we're not talking about, there's oodles and oodles all over the state. There used to be, we used to have the largest lake west of the Mississippi. That lake is now gone. There are all kinds of amazing systems that used to be part of our great state that are no longer there. So when people, I hear and I understand that there's a lot of concern about, well, how do we deal with these groundwater dependent ecosystems in the context of SGMA? I think what we need to remember is that we're making these decisions in the context of, we're talking about the last bit. And so we have a lot of responsibility to just operate understanding that most of what we're talking about is gone. The study that we did tells a story that I think won't surprise a lot of people, which is that in general, there was a lot of pumping between 1922 and 2009. Pumping went up considerably. So over this period, if you look at the combined usage of groundwater and surface water, it increased from, I think, 9.9 million acre feet to 22 million acre feet. Of that, groundwater increased from about 3.3 million acre feet to 10 million. So essentially, you want this, the buzz line, we tripled the amount of pumping that we were doing in the Central Valley over this period. The question isn't, is pumping bad or good? We were pumping, we need to pump. It's an essential part of our water supply. The question that we are asking with the study is, so what is the impact of that pumping, of unlimited pumping? And one thing I really want to emphasize here is, so this study that we did was all pre-drought. So the impacts that we're talking about to these river systems are all before the drought. What we know during the drought, and we don't have the data, we haven't been able to run the models for what happened during the drought. What we know is that the pumping went up significantly during the drought. So one could probably guess that the impacts that we're talking about from the study became worse. Really quickly, for those who aren't in this deeply, most of the rivers that are in the Central Valley are what we call gaining systems. So historically, our river systems had groundwater underneath them that were so great, such healthy aquifers, that actually the aquifers are pushing water up and pushing them out through our river systems. So I'd like to tell people that you can think of our rivers and our streams as a surface expression of a healthy groundwater system. There's no doubt that our groundwater is doing well when you can actually see the water pushing up to the surface and being pushed out. Of course, as we do pumping, there are impacts to these surface flows. And this is pumping near the river, it's pumping far from the river. The question is time and impact to the river. It's all connected at the end of the day. As we pump, we start to pull water out of the system. And you can do it to the extent that you're actually pulling more water out of the system than you're contributing to the system, at which point you have a losing system. So instead of contributing groundwater to surface flows, you're actually depleting stream flows through the pumping. It's resulting in less flows in that river system because of the pumping. And in some of the worst cases, we can actually start to disconnect our river systems. And this is basically the story of the Central Valley. And we see this in 3 phases. Now I'm going to toggle between a couple of maps here, and I'll kind of slow and zero in so that you can kind of digest it. But what our study showed is basically, I'm going to show you time lapse. So this is the period, what the average looked like in terms of gaining and losing streams. Gaining streams are blue, losing streams are red. And even by 1922, we had several systems that were in a losing condition. Of course, what happened as we tripled our groundwater pumping over time is that a lot of the streams that were in blue become red. So I'll just kind of show you over time. So this is 1922, beginning of the study period. This is the 2000s, the end of the study period. And you can just see what the impacts are. And in particular, you see the areas of the San Joaquin go from blue to red, and probably most disturbingly, parts of the Sacramento being at that tipping point and looking like they're converting from those gaining streams to the losing streams. So the story that we're able to tell by running this simulation is that by about 1920, we knew that many of the systems in the Tulare Basin were losing systems. That by 1960, with increased pumping, we had begun to reverse those river systems. So they also converted from largely gaining systems to largely losing systems. And that most disturbingly, again, the Sacramento Valley by the 2000s, pre-drought, was looking like it was at that tipping point where it was starting to convert from a gaining system to a losing system. Now, that's a bummer if you care about nature, so that's where that hits me. But if that doesn't concern you at all, and there are those for whom that doesn't matter, if you consider that 65% of our water supply for the state of California comes down the Sacramento, you should care a lot. Because what we're essentially doing is we are pulling through our groundwater extractions surface water supply. So because of all of those impacts, a lot of this study was the impetus and kind of the platform under which the Nature Conservancy engaged in SGMA. And so we are a very integral part of passing SGMA and trying to get the legislation into place, because we knew not only is this bad for nature and the things that we care about, but it has some serious ramifications for the surface supply and how we think about water management in the state of California. The other thing I wanted to emphasize here, we looked at a single event of pumping in the Sacramento Valley just to kind of simulate what would happen. And so the hypothetical was, if you pump in one event 186,000 acre feet of water, how long does it take to recover from that single pumping event? So if you look at this graph, what you're seeing is on the left is the percent of the water that's recovered from stream depletions. In other words, how much of that groundwater is recovered from our surface water. And on the x-axis, what you're seeing is the number of years it takes for that recovery to happen. So in a nutshell, you're seeing 95% of the recovery coming from stream flow, from surface water, and that it takes up to 50 years for that recovery to happen. So for people who are walking around saying, oh, cool, our reservoirs are full, there's snow in the Sierra, drought, so what, we've got it. We really need to think about what's going on in our groundwater storage. Because what we've done over the past several years in order to compensate for the lack of surface flow is to rely on groundwater. And the ability to recover that groundwater isn't going to happen with one great El Nino year. It's going to take several years. It will take decades. And I know people are driving around looking at the reservoirs and saying, oh, they're full, we're good. We're not good, because actually 38% of our state's water supply comes from underneath our ground in a normal year, and those reservoirs that we've depended on for the last several years are not going to recover for several decades. It's another important thing we need to consider as we're looking at SGMA, is that we don't even know the extent of the problem yet, because the stuff that we've done in the last couple of years has yet to fully express itself. We don't have a handle on what that looks like. So some key findings from this study: there's been a lot of pumping, and I think we've recognized that change is needed by passing SGMA. So that's a good thing. We know that we need to do some things differently. Can't overemphasize that groundwater and surface water are intimately connected. The things that we're doing underground that look like a different source of water, it's all connected. And again, depending on the distance you are pumping from the river, it may take longer to happen, but those two systems are connected. As I mentioned, we are at the tipping point, or we have passed the tipping point in the Sacramento Valley. There's this tail, there's a clear trend. As you increase pumping, we start to lose our river systems. They go from gaining systems to losing systems. And that has serious implications for our water supply, especially in the Sacramento Valley. And again, these impacts that we're seeing that we haven't fully seen, actually, from the drought. And so thinking about that is something we can take into our SGMA conversations. For me, what all of this really comes down to is a question. And we've been talking about this a lot during this conference, is this value, this community value decision-making about what do we want sustainability to mean for us? And to me, what that question is, it looks like this. It's, do we want to have river systems that have healthy flows in them, that have fish that are in them that our kids can go fishing for, they can go kayaking in these rivers, a place for us to get respite from the hot valley sun? Is that the kind of place we want, or do we want something that's dry and barren so that we can set the limit a little bit lower? SGMA is fundamentally about setting limits, and the question is, where do we want to set those limits? And I would argue, I would love for it to be blue and wet. So I just want to, in closing, let you know the report's available online. It's a huge technical document that has all the information on the model runs. It's available on our website, scienceforconservation.org. There's both the huge technical document as well as a short summary. If you're not into big technical documents, the summary, I recommend it. It's a lot shorter. The other thing I wanted to do is acknowledge a lot of folks went and worked on this study. A couple of our previous TNC colleagues, Dan and Maurice, as well as RMC, who was the consultant who did a lot of the modeling for us, and then, of course, the Water Foundation, who funded this work. Thanks.
So have you noticed any improvements in some of the things that you've done to bring some of the groundwater back up to where it needs to be? Things that you've done. I know we've worked with you on putting some of these plans together. Are you starting to see, you say you have 10% left. Is it going down? Is it going up? Are we sustaining it?
Yeah, I think at this point, because of the drought, it is going down. And, anecdotally, I can tell you, I've seen places that have always been green, in places of the southern part of the state and then the valley and the north part of the state they're dying, where the trees are dying, where the habitat's dying. These are places that we own properties. So I think anecdotally, and I'm not a scientist, so let me caveat everything I say by that. Anecdotally, I don't think it's getting better. I think what we're doing better now is we're starting to understand how important groundwater is to these ecosystems and trying to get really specific. So we know as you go to manage groundwater, people are saying, well, what do you need? Is it 10 feet of, is it depth to groundwater of 10 feet? Is it 20 feet? Is it all year round? Is it during the summer? I recognize those are very practical water management questions, and that's what the Conservancy is spending a lot of energy on, is trying to get answers to those questions so that we can think of these ecosystems as another management need, as another demand in the water system, and trying to put it in terms that a water manager can deliver for. So I think we're looking at both scientifically trying to describe what is it precisely that these species need to persist, as well as what are some of the recharge projects that can happen across the state that can benefit both the agricultural communities, the urban communities in these places, while providing habitat benefits, because they go together. And in a lot of cases, the good recharge area happens to be on a floodplain because the soils are there. We're going back to nature in a lot of ways with this stuff, and so we're trying to figure out how do you do both at the same time.
Do you really think our species is capable of doing anything about this?
I sure hope so.
I'm serious with this question.
Yeah, I am an optimist by profession because I have to be. And, I have a 5-year-old son, and I joke with people, I say, well, I was debating putting, kind of thinking about a college fund or just buying him a well and a watershed in a really, place that has really great water rights. And I'm opting for the education fund, and this is why. I think it's been mentioned earlier today, this is California. And while we may be behind on the groundwater curve right now, I really believe that SGMA is our inflection point. It's got to be a turning point for us. We've got the best technology. We've got some of the best academic institutions. We've got the most money. We've got this powerhouse of an agricultural economy. We've got all the right elements to solve this. I don't know exactly what the solution is, but we have to figure it out. So, I think for some people, the stuff that I talk about will be inspiring. For some people, the technology will be inspiring. For some people, having more productive ag will be inspiring. Whatever it is that floats your boat, let's just do it together. I mean, we have to figure it out. So that's my answer. Is I'm an optimist. So I tend towards the rosy side of this. But I also feel like if we can't figure it out in California, the whole world's screwed, and I don't accept that as reality.
Okay, final question.
Sandi, we've all seen the rain graphs of variability across the last century and tree ring data that shows extreme variability in the past, extensive droughts. How do you recommend SGMA or GSAs thinking about groundwater-dependent ecosystems in terms of variability and the thresholds or the points of triggers at which to be concerned and adjust to that kind of variability?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. That's a great question. Yes, so we are in a Mediterranean climate, and we have periods of drought, and we have periods of flood, we have periods of fire. This is all normal in California, and it's going to be the new normal in the world of climate change. So there is a lot of variability, and I think what that means for water managers is that the range at which we operate is going to be pretty vast. And part of it is going to come down to what can we tolerate as a community. So as our local GSAs are making decisions, do we tolerate the riparian habitat dying off every 10 years? so we can manage at this level, knowing that in order to restore it or get it back, it's going to cost how many millions of dollars. Those are trade-offs. Those are questions that need to be made at the local level. But I do think recognizing that there's this inherent variability and that it's going to take a while to figure out exactly what the bars are on the upper and the lower limits of this stuff. It's going to take a while. And I always preach the precautionary principle, which is that which you don't know, manage for and buffer. And as we get more precise, you can make that, you can make your range narrower, but if we don't know, it should be wider.